If you want to be a better writer, there are 3 things you need to do. 1, understand storytelling principles. 2, see how other writers have applied those principles. And then 3, use them in your own work. Here on the Story Nerd podcast, our goal is to demystify story theory. We'll help you with the first 2 steps so that you can get started with the third. My name is Valerie Francis. I'm a writer and literary editor, and I focus on stories by, for, and about women.
And I'm Melanie Hill, writer, editor, and poet, and I have a passion for middle grade and young adult stories, spy stories, fairy tales, and master detective novels.
On today's episode, Melanie pitched Dune so that we can study genre. This 2021 film has been marketed as action, adventure, sci-fi, and drama. It was directed by Denis Villeneuve from a screenplay by John Spates, I hope I'm saying that right, Denis Villeneuve and Eric Roth, based on the book by Frank Herbert. This is the first part of a trilogy, and it was nominated for a whole bunch of Oscars, including Best Cinematography, Best Production Design, Best Visual Effects, Best Original Score, Best Sound, and Best Film Editing. But it was not nominated for Best Screenplay, and there is a reason for that. Now, this is the time when I'd normally give a spoiler alert, but there's nothing to spoil. Melanie, what are your thoughts?
Well, I have to admit that I have not read the book Dune. Even though I've got it there on my to-be-read pile, I haven't read it. So I will just say that I'm analysing this story, the story in the movie and not the story in the book. And I think that this is a perfect example of don't judge a book by its movie. But I won't know until I've finished reading the book. But anyway, so I think we're vibing along the same lines here, Valerie. So what did I expect when I watched Dune? Well, I expected an epic science fiction movie and a story that I could jump on board and love, like many other science fiction movies. And because the book is so popular and well regarded, and the movie received an audience score of 90% on Rotten Tomatoes, I was expecting something much better. So the movie didn't meet my expectations. So I'm going to start by trying to understand what an action-adventure sci-fi drama movie is and what that is telling us to expect from this story, and maybe why it didn't meet my expectations. So I think that action and adventure are the same thing. And what that means is that the story will have a lot of physical movement in it, like chases, landslides, crashes, explosions, fight scenes, and all of those types of things that we would expect. At various points in the story, the protagonist's life will be in danger and that the threat will get closer and closer to being realised. And there's no question that Dune meets that expectation that I had because of the type of action and adventure that exists in the new world. So from a science fiction perspective, I think it did meet a certain level of my expectations, the setting, the modes of transport, the weapons, the costumes. They did deliver on some of my science fiction expectations. And drama. Now, drama is defined by the Merriam-Webster Dictionary as a state, situation, or series of events involving interesting or intense conflict of forces. There are a series of events in Dune, but the most important word in the definition above is interesting. And I think that that has helped me pinpoint where my expectations of this movie weren't met. I won't go into this a great deal now because I think Valerie will talk about what's interesting or not a bit later on. But I wanted to draw out some positive aspects of the movie. So there were some things that I did find that were quite good, and they really focused a bit around the story and the world building. So there was a clear identification of the protagonist. So Paul is front and centre in the movie, and he gets most of the story time. The planets and their environments, well, they are very distinct, and it's very clear when you're moving from one world to another. And I think the interesting point I'd note too about the planets is they are what I would say are mono environments. So a planet like Dune is filled with desert. So it's not like Earth where you have multiple different environments or climates. There's like this mono environment. And so that's a really interesting point as a writer to note. And I do believe that the costumes were interesting as well. And I think that's always something that you do expect when you go into a science fiction movie, is to look at how people or the characters are presented and what their external presentation is. So I think Dune did a really good job with some of those costumes. The most disappointing of aspects of the story for me, in terms of some of the world building, were the political systems and the power at play, and I found them very difficult to understand. So I'm guessing that this is where knowing the story would have helped. So the world building in the movie, I don't think was as well developed as it could be, and I think if you have to rely on prior knowledge or understanding of the book, then you probably haven't delivered the right type of story or done the right building in the movie. So another disappointing aspect were, where did the voiceovers come from? So there were a few voiceovers or voices in the movie, and the beginning one was easy to understand. That was some scene setting, but then there were some other voices that Paul heard as he's having visions or dreams, and I've got no idea of where they came from, what they represent, and are they linked into any of the myth that's sort of supporting the world. The betrayal by Dr. Yu made no sense at that point in the movie, and I think it was such a missed opportunity to create suspense. And I think that tapped into other parts of the story as well that were realised or happened, and then you got a bit of an explanation as to why they happened. And I really do think that the writers probably missed some good opportunities to create tension or create suspense or show the political machinations that were happening in the background. There is also so much untapped character potential in Dune. The characters in a story, I believe, must reflect aspects of the genre or the premise or the theme. And Robert McKee, in his book Character, says, no matter how a story's event design entices curiosity, readers and audiences are ultimately anchored to the telling through its characters. And that's on page 16 of Character. There is very little character development in Dune. I found it difficult to care too much about most of the characters, including Paul, and this could be because Paul showed so little emotion to most things, except when he meets Duncan Idaho again after he returns from a flight, and then he also meets Thufir Hawat when they move to the new planet. I wasn't sure what Paul cared about for most of the story, and the only thing I know about Paul's want was that he didn't want to be the Duke of the House of Atreides. However, Lady Jessica is one of the most fascinating characters in this story because she has the most conflict points. She's an acolyte of the Bene Gesserit, and she's gone against their orders, which were to produce only daughters. She's also protected by them, and she is teaching Paul, who is her son, the ways of the Bene Gesserit in secret. She's also pregnant, she has mysterious powers, her husband dies, and she believes that Paul is Kwisatz Haderach. Oh, sorry, I know I should get that right, but I'm not sure how to pronounce that properly. And that is the Kwisatz Haderach is a super being who can lead humanity to a better future. So she's put a lot on the line, and it's realised very early in the story. And we can see the anguish this causes her at multiple points. And towards the end of the movie, her conflict seems to fizzle out a bit too. So by examining the characters' storylines in Dune, it really brought home to me the idea that conflict is queen, and conflict that threatens the life of the protagonist is the most powerful queen of all. So do we have an expectation of conflict in stories? Absolutely, we do, because without conflict, stories are just recounts. The genres for Dune are pretty clear. It's a sci-fi action movie. The events threaten the protagonist's life and it moves up and down. The action moves or is meant to move up and down the life and death scale. But from a story perspective, it didn't work for me. I found that I didn't care a great deal about the characters or what was happening. So, Valerie, that's pretty damning. So, what did you think?
Well, honestly, it's hard for me to say what the genre of Dune is because we only get a fraction of the story. Sure, it's science fiction. I agree with you there. But beyond that, there isn't enough for me to analyze. Presumably, when the whole trilogy has been released, it will be some kind of action story, but that's an assumption. So, like you, I feel like it's going in a certain direction, but since I haven't read the novel either, I'm just guessing. Now, I know that this movie is a hit with critics and audiences because I too looked into it after my first viewing of it when I sort of was scratching my head. I know Timothy Chalamet and Zendaya are huge stars, so that's certainly part of the film's success. You can't deny the star power. And like we said off the top, it was nominated for 9 Oscars and won 6, but those were for categories other than writing. And so, as far as I'm concerned, they fall outside the scope of this podcast because I'm really focused on the storytelling here. So, if we strip away the stars, the costumes, the music, and the CGI, what do we have left? And the answer is not much. I'm sorry to the fans of Dune, but it's not much there. Dune is a tried and true science fiction novel, and it kind of comes with a built-in audience. There are fans of this novel who would really love to see it on the screen. I totally get that. When we studied Rogue One, we talked about world building and how part of what we're doing here is creating an environment that our readers want to hang out in. And when audience want to be in a world, the writer doesn't necessarily have to do too much storytelling. Not every story needs to be as heavy as the power of the dog, right? Sometimes it's just fun to be entertained. Now, Melanie, you and I both saw Top Gun Maverick this past weekend, and we agree on that too. Honestly, that film is just plain fun. The story itself is rice paper thin, but it doesn't matter because meeting Goose's son and seeing all those great flying scenes is a hoot and a half. Everyone in the theater that I went to, everyone came out with a big smile on their face because I was watching. I was curious. And the theater was packed. A story also doesn't have to be loud and full of spectacle either. Now, films and TV shows lend themselves to spectacle, of course, but there are lots of examples, and The Power of the Dog is one, which have little to no spectacle, and they're, quote unquote, quiet films, but they're nonetheless compelling. Better Call Saul is another great example. It's a slow burn, that one, but it does burn. And that's because The Power of the Dog and Better Call Saul and those types of stories, films, TV shows, they have incredible writing supporting the performances. Dune isn't so lucky. To me, it's boring. This is a boring movie. In 2.5 hours, not much happens. And what's worse, just like Melanie said a minute ago, I had no emotional connection to any of the characters. Now, Melanie and I do our analysis separate, and then we come together to record the podcast. So we're both writers, we're both trained editors, we deal with writers every day of our lives. We are analyzing stories every day of our lives. And we're both coming to very, very similar conclusions here. We're not just trying to be cranky. This is our honest opinion. Now, I take it that Timothy Chalamet is a heartthrob, but honest to God, in this film, he just kind of stands around looking mournful. And I think back to the BBC version, the miniseries of Pride and Prejudice, where Colin Firth had nothing to say hardly, and he just stood around looking, glum. But he was totally sexy. So maybe the fans of Timothy Chalamet see what he's doing in this film and also think it's really sexy. I mean, I think it's supposed to be his smolder. I don't know. It didn't work for me, but then I'm old enough to be his mother. And I have a question. Why are there so many close-ups of his hand? His right hand, it's down in the water, it's picking up flowers, it's picking up sand, he's holding it up to the sky, he's, looking at the sun through his fingers. There's a lot of close-ups of his hand, and I don't know why. I'm assuming this is some sort of setup and that his hand is going to be crucial to the plot somehow. I don't know, though. Zendaya, the other big star, she's hardly in the story at all. In this part, I guess she's going to play a bigger role in part 2. She appears on the screen in only a handful of scenes, really, and mostly, except for the last maybe 20 minutes, mostly she's there as a part of Paul's dream. And even then, the images are of her looking backward over her shoulder. Why? That image is repeated so much that it's either really important to the plot, this fact that she looks over her shoulder, or it's a lack of imagination, a lack of coming up with another shot to show Zendaya. And then it just becomes really repetitive. And if the whole thing about this movie is that it's a spectacle and a feast for the eyes, and it is in many ways, many, many ways, then we need to see different shots to hold our interest. Because once we've seen Zendaya looking over her shoulder at us once, why do we need to see that again and again and again? Just like the shot of Timothée Chalamet's hand. If you want to show him picking up a flower as a memory or as a keepsake from his home planet, great. But why do we constantly see his hand over and over? I don't know. Maybe it's a thing. Maybe it's important to the story. And while I'm at it, Rebecca Ferguson, who plays Lady Jessica, Paul's mother, is only 12 years older than Timothée Chalamet. Like, what the heck? She's 38 years old and a very young looking 38 at that. She is a wonderful actress. So this is not a criticism of her in any way, but I found it awfully hard to buy her as Paul's mother. His sister, yes, or maybe a nanny or something like that. Even he's too old to have a nanny. Come on, but his mother, I don't know. I found that hard. So these are just some high-level initial thoughts that I have about Dune, and I'll get into some more specifics later on. Melanie?
Well, that's really interesting. So I think we came to pretty much the same conclusions as we were watching it this week. And I know I talked a bit about it in our podcast that we did on Rogue One. One of the features, I think, of science fiction movies is world building, and it's a very important part of that particular type of story. And I think it's important to make sure that new visitors to the world are introduced to how the world works. Now, in our recent episode, like I just mentioned, world building, I think, is one of the most important aspects of science fiction and fantasy stories' successes, which is evidenced by an audience's willingness or even demand to go back and revisit that world. When I compare Rogue One to Dune, I see a massive difference in the world building. The Star Wars universe has been well and truly established over many years with various movies, books, and series. Star Wars has also established the forces of antagonism and the power hierarchy and imbalance in the first movie, A New Hope. Dune does not bring new arrivals like me along for this ride. In fact, the Emperor who's pulling the strings in Dune is only referred to in passing. The House Harkonnen are the villains on screen, and they are identified because they conform to what I call the 4 Bs. And the 4 Bs are my way of describing the bad guy stereotypes, which are big, bald boys who wear black. Now, there are some other examples, I think, of poor world building. And remember, this is a new world for me. So when I pull these out, these are things that I didn't understand. So I had no idea that the Firhawat is a mentat. and I have no idea what that means for the story. The only glimpse we get of his powers is right at the beginning when his eyes roll back as he mentally calculates the cost of the Emperor's envoy. What place do the Bene Gesserit hold in the power structure of the world? I don't know. Jessica's instruction to bear daughters is not explained properly because the Bene Gesserit believe it's her daughter that will bear a son who is destined to become the Kiswat Haderach, that super powerful being. So what are the consequences for Jessica and the meaning of this? Is the Emperor aware of what she's done, and does he believe that that's a threat? I don't know. That's never explained, or that connection is never made in the movie. The dagger given to Jessica when she arrives on the new world is made from the tooth of a Shah Halad, the sandworms. And is that important? And why is that important? Does that buy into a myth or part of the myth that her and Paul have created or are part of? I don't know. It doesn't explain what the significance of that is. Why do the houses of Harkonnen and Atreides dislike each other? Could it be because one of them doesn't like bullfighting and the other one does? I don't know. I'm not sure. And this is a very minor point, but I found it really interesting. So why are there bagpipes in the year 10,191? And of all the things that we could take from Earth into a new uniform, we took bagpipes. So I'm sorry, I found that very distracting and it made no sense in the context of the movie whatsoever. So, Valerie, I've listed off a few things there in terms of the world building that I found difficult or and there were many more questions I had, but I'd be interested to know if you had any others or there were things there that you thought were questions that weren't answered or you would have liked further explanation of. So what do you think?
The 4Bs, like, that is awesome. I am not going to be able to watch a film from now on without, seeing the 4Bs in the bad guy. All right. So when it comes to world building, I think you nailed it. I really do. Presumably, Dune will be an arch plot story that follows the hero's journey. There's enough hints in this film that makes me think that that's the way it's going to go. And we've said in past episodes that most stories are arch plot, but thankfully, there are so many talented writers out there who are innovating that form in a way that makes the stories relevant to modern audiences. But Dune isn't one of them. It seems to be adhering quite closely to Campbell's monomyth. And because of that, we have characters who are stereotypes. Now, the problem with stereotypes isn't that they don't work. It's like cliches. Cliches work really, really well. That's why we keep using them. Stereotypes are great characters. That's why we keep using them. But the problem is that we've seen them so often that they're predictable to us. And when we can predict what a character will do based on what we've seen that type of character do in the past, we lose interest because we know what's about to happen. Nobody wants to watch a story or read a book when they know what's going to happen. We're always looking for something new and fresh. And as storytellers, our challenge is to write stories in new, fresh ways that will hook our audiences and capture their imaginations. So there's nothing new about Paul's story, about he's the chosen one and all that kind of stuff. This is Harry Potter, right? But J.K. Rowling certainly captured our imaginations, and we have empathy for Harry right in chapter 1 of the first book, 100%. So this version of Herbert's novel is presenting a story we've seen 100 times before, with characters we've seen 100 times before. It is a beautiful spectacle for the eyes. I can't deny that. But there's not much meat on the bones here. Again, and I cannot believe I am doing this, but again, I'm going to use Top Gun Maverick as an example of what I'm talking about.
Woohoo!
I'm making Melanie very happy now. There's nothing new or fresh about the characters in Top Gun Maverick. It isn't. They're characters we've seen before, and it's a world we've been to before. But what that movie does so well is balance a world we want to revisit and characters we want to meet again with fresh new aerials. honestly, I'm not the biggest Tom Cruise fan in the world. I'm really not. And Melanie knows this. But I can't deny that he understands his industry inside and out. He knows how to make a Hollywood film. He knew he had to bring something fresh to the table. And the thing that's in keeping with his personal brand is the stunts, right? So if he was going to do a Top Gun remake, he had to do it in a way that no one else has ever attempted or has ever even dared to dream possible. That's why he comes on screen before the film and he welcomes the audience and says, thanks for coming out to the theater, even though we're in a pandemic and all that kind of stuff starting to come out of it. But thanks for coming to the theater to see this movie. And he drives home the point that the aerial footage is real. It is not CGI. Those are real actors in real planes doing real stunts. That is the Tom Cruise thumbprint right there. That is on brand for Tom Cruise. And they are really good. So even though it's characters we've seen before, it's a rice paper thin story, it's a world we've been in before, it is a fun movie. Dune isn't offering us anything new or fresh. And unfortunately, it isn't offering the actors anything that they can sink their teeth into and that they can really bring to life either.
Well, yes, I agree. And I'm feeling ripped off now because we didn't get that introduction that you obviously got in the cinema with Tom Cruise coming on and telling us about the reality of the flying. So
did you not? Oh,
no.
my.
No. So I'm feeling like I've missed out. Or maybe, I don't know why we didn't get that. But yeah, I'm feeling ripped off.
Oops.
No, it's good. That's interesting. But I think the world building in Dune and just the storyline, I think is very incomplete. And it's good sometimes to have questions about the world in a movie due to the time constraints. And so there are probably some good reasons as to why the world is incomplete. But the story does need to make sense as a standalone story as well. And I don't think Dune does that at all. So again, I recommend the book, Building Imaginary Worlds, The Theory and History of Subcreation by Mark J.P. Wolfe, to get a good grasp on what to consider when building another world. And it will give you, that book is, like I said, I think in our Star Wars episode, it's pretty much a Bible of world building. So I can't recommend that highly enough to you as a writer if you want to build a world and the things and want to know about the things to consider. Now, I think Dune 2021 suffers because it's told in the wrong format. For me, it should be a series, so the storytellers have time to create the world properly. The movie format has caused this story to be abbreviated to the point where it's difficult to follow without prior knowledge. Dune is a science fiction classic that lends itself to the space opera treatment. There's generational friction, there's power plays, there's factions, hostile new worlds, and it could be a Game of Thrones in space. And like Valerie, I had a lot of trouble caring about anything that happened in this movie. So it only met some of my expectations, but on a very superficial level.
Okay, I want to repeat a quote that Melanie gave us back in our Being the Ricardos episode. It's from Aaron Sorkin, his masterclass. You guys should watch that if you haven't seen it. It's quite good. Aaron Sorkin says, when you're a writer, especially when you're starting out, but I think it's a good rule for the life of your career, you need to be a diagnostician. When you see something and it doesn't work, instead of just being snarky about it, and instead of just joking with your friends about how bad this thing was that you just saw, figure out why it's bad. Your goal should be to diagnose it. Why didn't it work? So sure, I can sit here and say it's boring and that it's not working for me. And not every story will appeal to everyone, and that's okay. That's the nature of art. But the trick for us as writers is to separate our personal preference from our professional opinion. So, taking inspiration from Aaron Sorkin, I took a close look at the movie to see if I could determine why I had the reaction that I did. And again, I'm only looking at the storytelling here, the writing. I'm not looking at the music, not the acting, not the special effects, just the writing. And here's what I learned. I know that long form storytelling is en vogue these days. It's showing up in film, TV, novels, and stage plays. In 1997, we had the first Harry Potter book. That was published, and the last one was published in 2007. We still have books today being published like that. Certainly in YA, we've got the Book of Life trilogy as an example, and dare I even go near Game of Thrones. In 2008, Breaking Bad aired, and it ended in 2013. In 2011, the Marvel movies started with Captain America, the First Avenger, and that is still going. Doctor Strange in the Multiverse of Madness is in theaters now. And in 2016, Harry Potter and the Cursed Child previewed at the Palace Theatre in London, and it opened on Broadway in 2018. And for those of you who don't know, Harry Potter and the Cursed Child is a 2-part play. It's, I think, about 5 hours. My daughter and I saw it. You go to see the first part, which is, I think, 2.5 hours, if memory serves. Then we went away and had supper and came back a few hours later and watched the second half. It's a full day. So I can see the appeal for creators in these long form storytelling because it allows lots of time to explore the characters and the fictional worlds. But let me tell you, as someone who has written a novel in 12 parts, it's hard to pull off. It really is. Why? Because as a writer, when you're writing in parts like this, you don't just have to hook your audience once. You have to hook them over and over and over with each new installment. So the start of each part has to be hooky, has to be dynamic and capturing the audience. But the end of each part has to be hooky as well. And you can't just end as everything on a cliffhanger because that gets really old. So you really have to have the fundamentals of storytelling well in hand in order to know how to pull this off. Because since audiences have to wait between parts, the pressure to deliver skyrockets. Now, Dune is going to be told as a trilogy. And to be honest, there's absolutely nothing here in part 1 that makes me want to watch the other 2 parts. Melanie talked about the potential for this to be a space opera, and maybe that potential is there. I don't know. I'm not an expert in space operas, so I couldn't really say. But what I can say is that long-form storytelling is infinitely more difficult than short form. There is a real art to knowing how much story you can fit into 2 hours of a film or, 80,000 words of a novel. You've got to know where to start the story and where to end it. And even though there's a tendency toward these 10-hour movies broken into parts, the way to do it is, I call it the Harry Potter model, although I'm sure lots of other people have done it as well, but it's where I first saw it. So that's why I think of it as the Harry Potter model. And that is to have one storyline that stretches the whole trilogy. In this case, it's a trilogy. In Harry Potter, it's 7 books. But then to have each film within the trilogy work on its own. And we see that in Harry Potter. Harry Potter and the Philosopher's Stone is a novel in and of itself. But the whole Harry versus Voldemort stretches the entire arc of all of the books. And just like Melanie said earlier, it has to make sense to viewers, moviegoers, who have never read or even heard of Herbert's 1965 novel. When you're telling a story in parts, you absolutely must have a solid understanding of the fundamentals of storytelling, including making sure that the protagonist is actively involved in the story from the get-go. So this brings me to my second point, and the second thing I noticed from Dune. Paul, as Melanie said, is the protagonist. That's really clear. I don't think anyone can argue that. He is the chosen one, like Harry Potter and like so many other protagonists in fantasy and sci-fi, like Jesus. I mean, it's this whole idea of the chosen one is not new. But Paul doesn't actually do anything. He wants to do things, but the other characters, his father, his mother, Gurney, Duncan, they won't let him. It's only at the end of the film when Paul finally steps forward to begin his adventure. And we saw this in Rogue One as well. There, the protagonist, Jin, didn't spring into action until the second half of the movie. Now, why is this a problem? Because our first job as writers is to get the reader emotionally involved in the story. That's called hooking the audience, right? The protagonist is the reader's or viewer's avatar in the story. He's our stand-in. He's our window into that world. And if we don't care about him, then we don't care about the story. Creating empathy for the protagonist is job number one for every writer, because the audience won't care what's happening unless they care who it's happening to. For example, in the first 30 minutes or so, here's what we learn about Paul. He has limited power to control other people's thoughts. He's still very much learning that skill. He has dreams about a girl. He's of interest to a mysterious and powerful woman who seems to be some kind of religious leader. That's it. Whoop-de-doo-dah. Paul certainly seems to be made of sterner stuff than, say, Luke Skywalker, but he doesn't get the opportunity to show it until the last half hour. But by then, we've been sitting through 2 hours of watching him standing around and doing something that I guess is a smolder. And this brings me to the scenes and the scene writing in this film. And I've saved the best for last here, because I think it's the scene writing that is at the root of all of the other storytelling problems here. In a way, it's kind of hard to talk about Dune from a writing perspective because there's so little story here to talk about. That's why I didn't give any spoilers off the top of the show, because I don't know what there is here to spoil. On one of my viewings of the movie, I tried to track the number of working scenes. And you know what? There aren't many. I didn't get all the way through to the end because, just get a half hour into it, 45 minutes, and you'll see there's not many working scenes, and that continues through the rest of the movie. There is a whole lot of exposition. There's a whole lot of characters standing around looking grave, and a whole lot of CGI. The music is doing the heavy lifting here. And before we got on the call, Melanie and I were talking about this. And we said that we only knew that there was tension in a scene because the music told us that this was a tense bit. So intellectually, we're like, oh, something's happening here. I should feel tension. The music is telling me to feel tension. Yet neither one of us felt anything. There's not much for the actors to do. So as an exercise, I want you to try watching the movie on mute. Just turn the sound off. That is when you notice how much footage there is of landscape, characters standing or sitting still, how much CGI there is, and how much they're relying on CGI to hold the viewer's interest. The first working scene comes at about 14 minutes, and interestingly, Melanie picked up on this exact scene. It's about 14 minutes in when Paul tells his father, Duke Leto Atreides, that he may not want to be a leader. But this scene works from the Duke's perspective, not Paul's, because it's the Duke who must decide whether to let Paul off the hook or tell him to man up. Even then, it's a dull scene because we have no idea what's at stake if Paul fails to take his place as Duke when the time comes. And worse still, his father actually lets him off the hook. He says that when Paul is called to be leader, quote, "If your answer is no, you will still be the only thing I ever needed you to be, my son." Give me a break. This does not work for so many reasons. Remember way back in episode 2 when I read a quote from Lisa Cron's Wired for Story? Well, if you don't remember, let me read it to you again. She writes, "Story, as it turns out, was crucial to our evolution, more so than opposable thumbs. Opposable thumbs let us hang on. Story told us what to hang on to. Story is what enabled us to imagine what might happen in the future and so prepare for it, a feat no other species can lay claim to, opposable thumbs or not. Story is what makes us human, not just metaphorically, but literally. Recent breakthroughs in neuroscience reveal that our brain is hardwired to respond to story. The pleasure we derive from a tale well told is nature's way of seducing us into paying attention to it. In other words, we're wired to turn to story to teach us the way of the world. Now, I'm sorry, but that is not the way the world works. In the real world, you know what kind of parent speaks to their kid the way the Duke speaks to Paul? The kind of parent whose kid still lives at home when he's 30. In the real world, we all have to step up to the plate and do the things that are hard to do. That's how we learn and grow and mature. That is what stories are here to teach us. Timothée Chalamet is 26 years old, and don't try to tell me that they are passing him off as a 15-year-old, that character of Paul is 15, because in the book, Paul is 15. That is stretching disbelief just too far. Dude is 26 years old. When the time comes, he better step forward, and that is what the Duke needs to tell him there. Not saying that just being his son is enough. Like, oi with the poodles already. Oh, I could go on, but I think you get my drift. So in a nutshell here, what I'm saying is that the creative minds behind Dune have chosen to focus on the visual presentation of the story. And yes, this is a stunning film to look at. The costumes are amazing. The CGI is incredible. The music really does work with the visuals. But the story is barely there.
I agree wholeheartedly with everything that you said there. And yeah, I don't particularly want my kids living at home with me when they're 30 years old. So I hope there's some better stories that come out to teach them how they have to mature and grow into themselves and grow into adulthood. Anyway, so today's action step. So today I'm going to advise that we look for conflict in a story. As you're reading your current book, track the conflict. It might be inside the character's head, or it might be a minor misunderstanding that builds conflict, or it might be something that comes at them externally that's big and hard for them to ignore. But conflict makes a story interesting, but it also has to be relevant to the story you're telling. And I'll go back to what I said before. Conflict is queen in a story. So have a look and see if you can pick out the conflict in the stories that you're reading or watching.
And that wraps it up for this week and for this season. Next week, Melanie and I will do a roundup of everything we've learned about genre from our study in the past 10 weeks. You'll definitely want to tune into that one. To support the show, please leave us a rating and review and tell your writer friends about us. For even more information about putting story theory into practice, subscribe to my Inner Circle by visiting valeriefrancis.ca/inner circle and follow me on Twitter and Instagram @Valerie_Francis. If you'd like to find out more about Melanie, visit melaniehill.com.au or visit her on Facebook @MelanieHillAuthor. And remember, story theory doesn't have to be difficult. It's a tool to help you write more, not less. So take it one step at a time and have fun.